Okay, everyone, now that I'm done kind of playing around my screen, I think we're good to start going here. It's 2 o'clock, I want to get moving here. This is Ray from Tech and Learning. I hope everybody's really been enjoying their conference today and hope that it is going well and that you're getting a lot out of it. It's a lot of great sessions going on, a lot of good information, and that's going to be continuing today right now with our friends, our partners here from Classcraft. I wanted, before we go too far, a special thank you to all our sponsors, including Classcraft, also Catch On, FileWave, Global Teletherapy, GradeCam, and Sanford Programs. And a thank you to all our association partners as well. You can see there. Today's virtual conference is focused on taking lessons learned from the current remote learning programs to create long-term plans that support effective teaching and learning both online and in person. I want to remind everyone to log into the Conference Hub if you haven't already. Once you're logged in, you can visit a sponsor booth. Obviously, after this session, you can visit our friends here at Classcraft or some of the other vendors if you need to talk to them. Have questions, live chat with them. You can see your personalized agenda. You can network with the more than 2,000 attendees today via the registrant directory and chat features. You can also access all the conference resources in the download section. After this presentation, we can also add this, any slides from this presentation onto that too for make available to you. You can also win prizes. Throughout the Conference Hub, you'll see that there are several buttons to enter yourself into our passport to prizes. Please visit all the pages using the navigation bar on the top of the page. Every time you find a button and fill in the form, you will earn 1 entry into the raffle. All entries are eligible for a series of prize drawings, but only 1 prize per participant. You can enter once for every button you find, and winners will be announced via email at the end of the conference. Before we go too far, just real quick, some housekeeping items. If you have any questions for the presenters during the webinar, please submit them through the Zoom chat feature. Please know we capture all the questions and our presenters are happy to answer them as time permits. Again, today's slides and other resources materials will be available and may be accessed within the Downloads tab of the Conference Hub. We encourage you to download any resources or links that you may find useful. And please be sure to use the hashtag TLTechLive if you're posting on social media. That all being said, thanks again to all our terrific speakers, and I am excited to introduce you to Shawn Young, the CEO and founder of Classcraft. And I'm going to stop sharing here and let Shawn take over now.
Thank you so much, Ray. Hey, everybody. My name is Shawn. As mentioned, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Classcraft. Really excited to be here with you today, talking about a topic that is really dear to our hearts here, but also generating a lot of conversations, a lot of interest right now. We're thousands and thousands of schools are reaching out to us to talk about this and solve for this really, big issue of how do we continue SEL in a virtual setting, and what about student participation, and how do we get kids motivated by something like SEL when it's hard enough to get them motivated to just log into their devices. So we'll get into that. Just quick pieces here of house cleaning. First of all, please jump into the chat at any moment. I've been an educator for a decade. I am very happy to be interrupted and field any questions. We also have 2 great team members here today, Kelly and Franco. You'll recognize them by their name. It says @Classcraft. And I'll do my best to answer what's coming in the chat verbally, but sometimes that's really distracting, so it makes me pause, and so I'll let them answer the chat as much as possible and try to loop some stuff in there. You can also use the Q&A module at the end. We'll have a little Q&A session, so if you have any more longer form questions that you want me to answer more verbally, you can also put them in the Q&A, and I'll make sure I get to those. We're just chit-chatting about this with Ray at the beginning. We're all getting a lot better at video conferencing, but some general tips in case you're running into any issues that we just like to share when we do these types of things. So before we get started, a word about me. I was a high school physics teacher for a decade, instructional coach, and also a web developer. Built a lot of. I was a teacher by day, programmer by night. Had a business consulting and building apps for all kinds of companies for that same decade. Built apps and websites for groups like Microsoft, Chanel, etc. So. And my third passion has been being a gamer. So I grew up with games, and I really wanted to create more community in my classroom. I was appalled by how competitive my students were, and so had the idea to use the mechanics, the culture of gaming to bring my students together. And I built Classcraft in my own classroom for that. And after 3 years of me using it for myself, I was like, this is really cool. Other educators should try this. And so this was 6.5 years ago. I made a website to talk about it. And the day that went online, 130,000 people came to the website. And it was very clear that, what I built to solve my own need resonated with a lot of teachers. So since then, we've grown to 7 million kids. We're in every single state. We're all over the world, 165 countries, and working with all kinds of organizations to help bring this idea that we need to think about peer intervention, behavior intervention, SEL, do that in a way that is intrinsically motivating and culturally relevant for kids. So that's kind of my background. But what we're seeing right now is a very unique time where, obviously you're here today because this is a unique time. And, whatever state you're in, there's been some sort of remote situation. And the one thing that's clear is that we don't know what's happening next school year. And so whether it's in person or remote or, most likely a mix of both, or it starts in person but then needs to switch back to remote, we don't know. And from that lens, it really behooves us to think about what Classcraft likes to call continuity, right? If we're going to be context switching between in-person and remote learning, we need to be able to, and doing that maybe multiple times in the same school year, be able to have whatever system we have in place for developing SEL competencies, behavior intervention, be able to work in both contexts. And we need to be able to switch easily. So that's one part of it. The other part of this conversation is, these types of reports are coming out more and more where we're seeing that student participation in online classes and remote learning is really bad. As low as 50%, 40% in some states. And there's a real issue there. I mean, behavioral issues aren't, and motivational issues aren't new. What's new is that it's very apparent that we're struggling to solve them because we've been acting extrinsically with students by being in person with them, and in fact haven't succeeded in making them see the meaning or be self-motivated for school. So this is a real challenge, and I would say this is the bulk of the societal issue is if we can't get kids to partake and communicate with us in a remote scenario, it's going to be really hard to do anything, let alone SEL. So more than ever, this stuff's important. And so, but beyond that, we believe that SEL is even more important than it was in the past, because even if we weren't explicitly developing SEL, by having students be in, a school community day in and day out, we're able to, educate them. By having them be remote, becomes really hard to have informal interactions with them, have opportunities to be mentors from a social and emotional learning standpoint. And so we need to be more intentional about it. However, what does that look like? What does that look like in context? And what does that look like when we think about it being genuine? So just to recap on what SEL is, it's developing skills for students so that they are effectively able to succeed in school and life. This is the definition put forth by CASEL. CASEL is this organization that operates nationally to define and support districts in social emotional learning. But ultimately, it's things like understanding and managing your emotions, setting goals, feeling empathy for others, etc. And what's important here is that, like, when you look at the description here, it's very obvious that these skills are more important than ever in a virtual setting. They're important in real life, but in a virtual setting, we really need to be intentional about helping kids develop these skills because they're just as important, except now kids are isolated and we're asking them to do things like set goals. And that means developing autonomy as learners, but in a way that we're not there to help them with. And the reality is that their parents don't necessarily know how to do this either. So we need to think about it and we need to be intentional. So what does that mean? So CASEL has developed this framework of competencies, and they're grouped into 3 color codes here. The first one is intrapersonal skills, so self-awareness, self-management. This relates to dealing with yourself and your own emotions and your own goal setting. Interpersonal skills, so social awareness, relationship skills, relating to others, and decision-making skills. And what's important here to note is that what CASEL proposes and puts forth as a framework does have instruction. Like, this is this dark ring here, but really the core of the approach is about teaching kids these skills. And it's really hard to teach somebody a skill like empathy through a lesson. And so it behooves us to think about how can we develop a skill like empathy in genuine contexts, right? How would I want to do that? Well, I would say, well, what does empathy look like in math class? And what are the behaviors that I'm expecting to see from a student to know that they're developing empathy and putting it forward? And how do I explain that to a child so that they know what's expected of them? And how do I track to see if they're actually developing? So it's one thing to develop. We also need to be able to assess. And so this is a skills-based model and a mastery-based approach versus an academic curricular approach. And what's fantastic here is that this lends itself really well to virtual learning because there isn't necessarily an SEL class, right? And students in a virtual setting are doing what they have to do to get, like, they're doing math and reading and English. They're not doing extracurricular here. So if we want to teach them these skills, we need to ingrain it in all of the learning. And so what does that look like? Here's an example of New York State is one of the big, there's 9 states that partnered with CASEL that raised their hand and said, we're going to put in place an SEL framework for our state based off of the CASEL model. And so these goals are the same, like this is the orange from before, this is the green, this is the yellow. And CASEL has done this, New York did it very explicitly in terms of, for each of these goals, let's identify some benchmarks. So what does self-awareness and self-management skills mean? It means identifying, managing your behavior, recognizing your supports that you have, other personal qualities, demonstrating skills related to achieving personal and academic goals. Now, this is super important stuff to be able to do in a remote setting. Just look at benchmark C here, achieving personal and academic goals. This means about self-managing, being able to set goals for yourself. And what we're asking kids to do right now, and this is something they've never known how to do, is be more autonomous than ever in their own learning. And so it's one thing to set wide rubrics. Why I'm speaking here about New York State is that they've gone one step further than what's in the initial CASEL framework, and they've actually identified behaviors that are observable that indicate development of these skills. And so educators should be on the lookout for students demonstrating the capacity, for example, to maintain concentration on a task. And they should be reinforcing that in kids, saying, hey, you were really on task today. Good job. Here's a high five. and like underlining that with highlighter when students do that, because this isn't something you learn in just one class. This is something you need to be able to do across all of your learning. And so this makes SEL skill development very tangible for educators, because it means that, like, okay, I just need to be on the lookout for these behaviors. Ideally, I'll keep some trace of when I observe it, reinforce it in kids so that I'm developing continuous development of these behaviors. But then also having some data so that I can look back and see how students are developing and assess. So saying, oh, well, Franco didn't get a lot of points for, or high fives, or didn't exhibit a lot of moments where he was maintaining concentration on a task. This is something he needs to work on. And I should signify that to him. So a very clear framework around competency building and mastery, achieving levels of mastery. Now, what's interesting is that levels of mastery change as well based on grade bands. And so New York has done this. We've done this as well for CASEL, identify behaviors and contextualize these expectations for early elementary school, middle school, high school. The expectations are different and the language is different, but ultimately it falls under these same rubrics. It's just, you don't expect the same level of autonomy in a first grader as you do in an eighth grader. So this is really what we're saying is, how do we do this virtually? One of the secrets to doing it well in person, but also virtually, is to have a whole school implementation framework. So we need to support educators in doing this by having integrating it school-wide. So it's not just them on their own, but it's actually the whole school. So setting expectations for the whole school, integrating this into school culture and climate. What does school culture and climate mean in a virtual setting? Is there even a school culture if there's no physical location? These are important questions that we need to be able to answer. We need to, attach that to behavior intervention, instruction, and more than ever include parents in this conversation, because they're our allies in this schooling from home situation. So we need to give them tools and we need to loop them in. So this is what we need to be doing. How do we do that? Let me switch tracks here to talk about games for a sec. This seems like, whoa, what a tangent. But hear me out for a second. You'll hear that, like, earlier on what I was talking about was we're having huge participational issues, right? Kids aren't engaging with remote learning. If they're not engaging with remote learning, how are we supposed to teach them and develop SEL skills? So we need them to care. We need them to be engaged. And to do that, we need to think about intrinsic motivation and we need to think about cultural relevance. SEL just doesn't sit in a vacuum. Your understanding of SEL is really built and predicated around your culture. So we're very lucky. There's actually a medium that is super culturally relevant for kids and that is intrinsically motivating, and that's games. So maybe you've heard of this game, Fortnite. If you're working with kids, there's a little strong chance that you have. Very, very popular game right now, and important for a bunch of reasons, but the fact that it's so popular is what makes it important to this conversation. What makes it important to this conversation is the photo on the right. That dance, maybe you don't know the game, but a lot of chances you know this dance. And though the dance didn't originate from the game, it was popularized by the game in a dramatic way. And when kids are doing this dance, the floss, they're not doing it to win at Fortnite. In fact, they're not doing it to even play Fortnite. They're not in front of a console doing that. They're doing that because that's their culture. When I was a kid, we would watch, MC Hammer videos and try to learn his dance moves, and that was culture, right? That was music, that was dance, that was video clips. Now the kids aren't doing that anymore. They're doing that through gaming. This is, if this isn't convincing enough, let me compare that to other cultural industries. This is a graph of the revenue generated by different cultural industries. The red line is music. That was 20 billion last year. Film, 44 billion. I'm talking Star Wars. I'm talking Avengers. And gaming last year was $150 billion cultural industry. Just completely dwarfs any other category. And in fact, we're like, whoa, this is crazy. But in fact, this isn't a new trend. This actually started a long time ago. And in fact, in 2008, gaming overtook film and music combined as a cultural industry. It was already bigger than both of those together. And this 2008 date is important for that reason, but it's also important because when you think of the age of our kiddos in schools right now, this is 12 years ago. So for the most of them, their entire life has been within the context of a very strong cultural medium that is games. So it's not TV, it's not music, it's games. And that's been for their entire life. Now, what's fascinating about games is that they transcend social economic disparities. They transcend, different ethnic backgrounds. There's this really strong universality when you look at who's playing these games as well. So we have this universal medium. Now, games are also fascinating because they're really good at driving intrinsic motivation. It's part of the reason we're seeing a breakdown in student participation in remote learning. One is because they don't know how to be good remote learners, but two, it's because we've been generally motivating them extrinsically in school. If you look at this description of what an extrinsic motivator is, it's trying to get to a good end state or avoid a bad end state. It's not about doing the activity, it's about the outcome. And so, think about grades, think about discipline. This is a lot of how school is structured. Whereas intrinsic motivation is you do something because you want to. And, one of my favorite examples of this is Tetris. Everybody knows Tetris. It's, that block building game where you try to make lines. It's the single most popular video game in the history of mankind. And it's pointless. And it's also really repetitive, right? And there's no ending. All you do is you drop bricks and try to make lines. And the graphics are terrible too. Why is Tetris so motivating? And I say it's motivating because nobody's forcing people to play Tetris. We play Tetris, humans play Tetris because they want to. So clearly intrinsically motivating. And the answer to that lies in how games are structured. Games are really good at being external systems that internalize motivation. One of my favorite examples of that is golfing. You'll see why in a second, but golfing, if you describe, basically the goal of golfing, it's to take a ball and put it in a hole. And if I were to tell you to do that, you would probably just pick it up, walk over to the hole and drop it in with your hands and be like, mission accomplished. I'd be like, no, wait, that's not golf. If you want to play golf, you have to use special clubs and you need to count your strokes. And you know what? You can't even dress the way that you want to do this. And so what I'm doing is imposing arbitrary extrinsic confinements on how you would normally behave. And in doing that, I'm giving that activity meaning. Because nobody would get up at 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning to take balls and carry them into a holes, but there's a lot of people that get up on a Sunday morning to go play golf. And the reason is because this extrinsic set of constraints, this external set of constraints, is structured in a way that drives intrinsic motivation. And that's what's so special about games as a medium. And in fact, game makers know this, and they build video games built around these different elements. So these are the core elements of self-determination theory. That's a very well-known theory of motivation, started in the 70s. And basically, the theory says that we are motivated by things that fulfill our fundamental needs. So one of those is competency. So going back to Tetris, why is Tetris so motivating? Because no matter how good you are at Tetris, you're always at the limit of your challenge, because the more you play, the faster the blocks go. So nobody ever can be perfect at Tetris. In education, we call this a zone of proximal development. Other elements of motivation are being in control, so having autonomy. So look at a game like Minecraft. Why is that game basically virtual Lego blocks? Why is that game so popular? It's because kids get a lot of control, a lot of creative leeway in Minecraft. The other element is relatedness, meaning tied back to social relationships in online games. And so there's a ton of research about this, but this specific study was done in 2006 where they looked at what drives motivation in video games, and they found that it was those elements that I just mentioned. And this study on the right was done in 2004 on how to motivate kids in educational contexts. And what we find is that they overlap perfectly. So best practice in pedagogy and motivation overlaps directly with what research is saying games are really good at doing to motivate. So we have a need. We need to teach kids SEL. We need them to care about it because we're not able to force it. And we have this really powerful cultural medium that is the main culture of kids right now. And luckily for us, it's connected back to driving intrinsic motivation. So what does that mean for SEL and what does that mean for virtual learning? So the last part of this puzzle is tiered intervention and approaching skill development and SEL development from a tiered framework. And so if you're not familiar with tiered interventions, this idea that to teach specific behaviors or ways of being, which is ultimately what SEL is, we need to have a common framework for all students. So this goes back to CASEL's best recommendations for whole school SEL implementation. We need these first 2 points are about a school-wide protocol and connecting that to a school-wide culture. So that's tier one. Tier one is having a common framework for all kids. And we need to reinforce that framework and we need to, encourage kids and teach them from that lens. Now, not all kids are going to respond perfectly to that. And kids that don't respond that well need specific targeted intervention or prevention. And so students that have tier 3 needs that are all the way at the top of this pyramid. They're pretty easy to identify. They're the ones that stand out in a group. These kids are pretty busy. They're very, you could ask a teacher, guess who has tier 3 needs, and they could immediately do that because these kids take up a lot of our energy and our time. They have a lot of needs. Now, in a tiered approach, the goal is to help kids as much as possible stay at the bottom of this pyramid. And one of the places that we're struggling, and this was before virtual learning, we've struggled on this one for a long time, is how do you identify kids that have tier 2 needs early on to be able to intervene early, to intervene effectively, and to hopefully solve that need and have tier 1 be sufficient for them. And the big problem here is that we don't have a lot of data. A lot of schools on the SEL front are using referral data as their main indicator of whether or not a student has good SEL development. And so we don't know what's happening leading up to referral. We don't know the good stuff kids are doing. We know about the worst kids when they're being the least well behaved. But what about all the kids? And what about kids that are flying under the radar that are struggling but aren't being referred? How do we identify those students? And so we need better data, and this is especially true in virtual learning because we don't have, eyes on site looking at kids and building holistic judgments about them. So we're in the dark. And so just a word on how to do this, and then we'll start talking about what's the connection between all of this. So obviously, we're talking here about prosocial skills, positive behavior expectations. As I was saying, we need to do this early. We need to teach this behavior to kids. So that means explicit instruction, as I was saying earlier on, but it also means in context reinforcement as behaviors happen, pointing them out and celebrating them. A lot of the best practices around behavior intervention and SEL skill development are about reinforcing positive behaviors. You've maybe heard of a practice called PBIS. Often a lot of best practices for SEL skill development really overlap with that. And so this is borrowed from the PBIS framework, but it also applies to best practice for SEL. And the first element here is, again, we need to do this school-wide. We need to define for a grade band or for a group of grade bands what our expectations are. So this is what New York State did. This is what CASEL is proposing to do, is say, what does self-awareness mean for a fifth grader? What does it mean for an eighth grader? And all eighth grade kids, or all fifth grade kids, or all, whatever grade band, whatever context that they're in, need to have that be reinforced and understand that. The second place where we need to do that is with teachers. So we need to set that school-wide, but then we need teachers to align their expectations and make that consistent with school-wide expectations. So, teachers obviously need to be in control here of setting their own classroom routines, being able to reinforce and celebrate the things that they care about, but it should be contextualized to a broader school-wide framework. And so we need to put systems in place. We need to put infrastructure in place, especially in a virtual setting, to be able to help teachers do that digitally. And, when we think about what's coming next school year, the very real possibility of context switching between brick and mortar and virtual education makes this especially important, because we need teachers to be able to reinforce these behaviors, teach kids SEL expectancies, and develop these competencies in those two contexts. And so we need to give them systems that allow them to be able to do it in person and virtually. This third point is about, let's encourage expected behaviors. A lot of schools do things like give kids tokens, PBIS dollars, Raider bucks, whatever they are, to celebrate good behavior. In SEL, you could be like, hey, if you're especially kind to somebody, you show empathy, you make responsible decisions when considering other students. This could earn you PBIS or Raider bucks. A lot of schools are doing this. The problem is that is twofold. The first one, there's no data when you do that. You don't know why kids are getting these dollars, and you don't know what was the context or for which behavior. And the second one is that there's no data, so you can't actually assess development of these skills because you don't know which kids are getting these paper dollars or why. So we need a digital system, and for a virtual setting, we need a digital system as well. So we need a digital system for the data, but we also need it because we can't give kids paper dollars. So how do we reinforce these behaviors? How do we encourage them? We need a digital reward system. Also, we need to be able to address problem behavior, and we need more than ever in a virtual setting to work with homes. So we need a system that allows parents to be a part of it as well. A lot of the times, this is what we see. This is a typical PBIS implementation. A lot of folks that are coming to SEL are coming through a PBIS door. There's different contexts, there's different expectations. It's pretty simple to imagine another line here that says virtual education and have expectations that are set there. And that's really important to be doing with kids. If we're going to be context switching between virtual and in person, we need to define virtual as just another context. School is continuing, and the virtual context is another one, just like transitioning in the hallway is a different context than being in the classroom, and the expectations are different. Obviously, we have an issue here because the reward system for these behaviors and the encouragement system often overlaps with buying candies and physical goods, and that doesn't work in a digital system. So we don't have data. These rewards wear out over time. Extrinsic motivators are less and less effective as time goes on. And this just isn't possible in a remote setting. So a word on students with tier 2 and tier 3 needs, and then we'll jump into what ties all this together and how we're doing this. So as I was mentioning earlier around tier 2, students with tier 2 needs, in a remote setting, it's really hard to identify these students because we don't have early indication data. We don't have referrals to track against at all. So we don't have any data for the most part, except maybe like logging in participation data. But that's not the same as rich behavioral data, understanding what they're doing in the day-to-day. So we really need this to be able to identify these kids. And we need to have be especially thoughtful of students with tier 3 needs because they're more at risk than ever, because often a lot of the challenges they have come from their home situation. And now that they're at home all the time, and we're not there to be able to support them during the day, a lot of these situations are being exacerbated. So how does this all come together? We need to motivate kids. We need to be able to empower educators and kids to develop SEL skills. We need to ensure continuity between brick and mortar and virtual learning. And we need to have a positive, preventative, tiered approach to doing this. So this is all the work that Classcraft is doing. So the way that CostCraft works is that CostCraft is a behavior intervention and social emotional learning platform for skill development that is using the culture of games and the mechanics of games to drive cultural relevance and intrinsic motivation for kids. So think about SEL skill development as a game. So it's not a video game. It's really the experience of school feels like a game. And so we have a whole plug and play ready-made configuration for the CASEL framework. And we've, much like New York, have identified specific behaviors that tie back to SEL competencies and that are super easy for kids and teachers to understand. So, hey, if the student shows self-control, they should gain 75 points. This is self-management. Self-management is also about setting goals. This is especially pertinent in a remote setting. So as kids exhibit these behaviors, they gain points. Now, the points aren't the reward. There's a real shift here that we need to operate in our minds, where traditionally PBIS bucks or Raider bucks or whatever they are those are the reward. In ClassCraft, the progress is the reward. When we think about intrinsic motivation, and we go back to feelings of competency and progression and Tetris, it's about progress. It's not about the points you have. The points are just a metaphor for your progress. And so you gain points in Classcraft, but they're meant to be a visual representation of the progress you're getting towards your own learning. And we'll talk about what that looks like in a sec. But basically, teachers can give kids points for exhibiting these very clear behaviors and indicators related back to CASEL competencies. Now, what's great is that you could do that for SEL development, but you could also connect it back to behavior expectations we would have for remote learning, right? So yes, I want you to be empathetic. Yes, I want you to show self-control in your behavior. At the same time, I also want you to be on time for a video lesson and submit your homework on time. So we can use the same framework to motivate and structure remote learning and teach kids how to be good remote learners, while at the same time also teaching them and encouraging them to develop SEL skills. And so in Classcraft, what that looks like is we have continuity. We're able to do this in person. We're able to do it virtually because it's a digital system and the rewards are digital. We're able to set behavior expectations commonly across all educators, be that for remote education or for SEL. So that allows us to context switch very easily. Kids really care about Classcraft. It's a game. So it's, again, like golfing, we have an extrinsic system that drives intrinsic motivation. Classcraft is also played as a team. So students aren't learning SEL skills in a silo. It's not just them, it's their whole team. And this is really interesting when you think about sports teams. Think about football players. I would say that being on a football team is a really good way to develop SEL, because when you look at football players, they're really in tune with one another. They make rapid, responsible decisions when considering other people's needs. They're able to read their teammates' state and intentions at a glance. And so these are all skills that are tied back to SEL and that come from having a team-based approach to success. In Classcraft, you can also put in curriculum, so we're able to have both of those live alongside each other, and that's really powerful for virtual learning, and parents can be a part of it. So how does it work? As I was saying earlier, kids get points for specific behaviors that we define as a school team. Then the points lead them to progressing, lead them to leveling up. And so they each have a character, and as they level up, they unlock cool swag. Now, cool swag maybe seems dumb to us adults because we're not gamers necessarily, but for kids, remember, this is their culture, and this is the whole model on which Fortnite is built. The whole point of Fortnite is to unlock skins. So in Classcraft, kids unlock skins as they level up. And this is really important because, again, it gives them a very clear sense of their progression and of developing mastery. If you ask any kid who's not in Classcraft, hey, are you good at SEL? They'll say, I have no idea. Hey, are you good at SEL? Yes, because my character's level 6. Look how cool he is. And, I know how I got good at this because I know exactly what I'm getting points for. So that becomes very motivating because there's very clear feelings of progression as they level up. Second piece is that, you'll remember earlier I was saying control and autonomy, speaking about Minecraft. This is an important dimension of intrinsic motivation, being in control. And so where can we give kids controls? Well, in Classcraft, as they level up, they unlock powers. And the powers in brick and mortar will be things like you can eat in class, you can skip the lunch line, you can, hand in your homework late. For virtual learning, it'll be things like you can get a 10-minute Zoom meeting with your teacher one-on-one. And the idea is that as they unlock these privileges, they're able to use them and decide when to use them. And in doing that, we're giving them more control, and more control leads to more motivation. So we have this very robust approach using game mechanics to drive intrinsic motivation. And again, they're playing on teams. So that helps them as well build community, but also get extra meaning out of the experience. And so they get little pets, they get these characters, etc. But they also get the feeling of success of helping their teammates, because whenever they help each other, they gain points. So what does this look like in brick and mortar? This is a teacher teaching an SEL STEM class in 7th grade, Chicago. Kids are doing their work. While they're doing that, she's going around and giving them points. Virtual, digital high fives. Again, the points aren't the reward. The progress is the reward. But for teachers, this is super easy to do, and even easier in a virtual setting where you're seeing kids have do specific activities, and you're able to give them points for that. Now, Classcraft also has a really powerful interface for teaching curriculum. It's called Quest. It's built around best practices of personalized learning and differentiated instruction. Kids are on a quest line. This could be a unit, for example, and each of these items is a learning activity, and teachers can create branching pathways. So students that have specific needs can go on one pathway versus another one. This connects into Google Classroom, and teachers are able to create quizzes using Google Forms to help students self-assess and move through this. There's a whole narrative element tied to this. So there's ready-made storylines. So it really feels for kids like they're going on an adventure, but this could be the coursework for their week. Now, bundled in Classcraft, we also have several of these quests that we've built to align with CASEL standards to teach kids about self-management, relationship skills, etc. So we have a whole series of stories that are tied back to SEL themes with learning prompts tied back to that. So teachers using Classcraft, let's say to teach math, could have kids go through their fractions quests, but at the same time have them go through SEL quests that are built in. So we can do as well direct instruction. A couple of last points. There's a lot in Classcraft. I'm only scratching the surface of everything that's there, but another feature we really like and care about is Kudos. When we were thinking about SEL development, one of the things that was really apparent to us is that it shouldn't just be teachers reinforcing this. Kids should be giving each other high fives. And so we built this Kudos system. And the way it works is that kids pick a behavior, they see a student exhibiting it, they write out a short little note to give context, and then that gets submitted to the teacher, and the teacher approves it, so that kids aren't writing things like "you're a jerk" or whatever. And when the teacher publishes it, it goes to a class feed. It can even go to a school feed where you can see all the great high fives and shout out kids are giving each other. So think about the impact of this on school climate and school culture, creating a culture of success between students. But also think about what is the best way to be able to learn a behavior, yes, to be reinforced, but eventually to be able to identify it in other people. And so if a student is showing empathy, and another student identifies that, that's really powerful learning happening. and verbalizes it. So when a kudos is given, both kids get points, both the receiver because they exhibited positive behavior, but also the giver because they're contributing to their own learning. There's a question here in the chat about what grade levels is ClassCraft most effective with. We have folks using it across all of K-12. We often have a lot of interest at middle school, but I built this in my own high school classroom, and we have people using it all the way down to kindergarten. So a last point on ClassCraft's feature set, we've been talking a lot about data. Another part of this that's really compelling is that, yes, we're motivating kids. Yes, we're teaching them SEL skills, but we're also giving school administrators and behavior teams the really powerful data to take action on, right? Because as teachers are giving kids these high fives, these points, we're actually able to track that and see at a glance, this is tier 1 data. What are all kids getting points for? Oh, being positive, logging into Zoom, etc. Oh, nobody's getting points for empathy. Maybe we should work on that. You can also see which students are getting a lot of points and which students aren't. And the kids that aren't are probably the ones that need the most help. So we're able to quickly identify students that are struggling, that aren't exhibiting positive behaviors. You can click on a student and see all the behaviors that they're exhibiting throughout the school day. So you can really quickly identify students with tier 2 needs and develop interventions for students with tier 2 and tier 3 needs as well. So this is just a graph and some bars here, but it's really hard to understate just the potential here in terms of better supporting our students, especially as we're in the dark with virtual learning. So this takes the whole thing full circle because now we're able to really help students that normally would fall under the radar. Before jumping to Q&A, a last slide about impact and research and efficacy. Obviously, SEL and PBIS and these different concepts aren't new. This is really well-researched pedagogy. What's new here, and we've been doing this for decades, it's not that new, but what's new is the impact of games and structuring this as a motivational first approach. And because of that, we've had a lot of researchers interested in the work we're doing and independently writing studies about ClassCraft. So this study here on the left is one of dozens done by the University of Charlotte 5 years ago on whether ClassCraft could be used to drive participation in online courses. And they saw in control groups that they had just over 50% participation rate in online classes. And when they used ClassCraft, they had a 97% participation rate. So really effective for online learning and participation. This middle panel is about a case study we did with a school in Georgia. They started using ClassCraft. They've been doing PBIS for multiple years and started using, it's kind of flatlining. Kids weren't caring about it as much. Again, extrinsic rewards wearing out over time. And they used ClassCraft and saw referrals go down 85% in a single term. And so really effective in brick and mortar and in remote learning. Last point here is just about our data. And I say our data, but really it's the school's data, and we're just custodians of it. We're hosting it for them. Schools can delete the data at any time. And one thing that's really important is that in PBIS and in SEL development, there's a very clear best practice that you should have a ratio of 4-to-1 positive versus negative reinforcement. And as we look across all the teachers using ClassCraft, we see a 7-to-1 ratio. And so that means that the system is helping teachers go beyond best practice. So really, really powerful stuff that we're seeing across the board. So as a follow-up here, we'll make sure that we send you, additional resources. You can have this presentation as well. But if you want to dig in on intrinsic motivation, on virtual PBIS, what we're calling virtual PBIS, and on an alignment assessment of ClassCraft from a CASEL perspective. This was done by Dr. Maurice Elias at the University of Rutgers. He's one of the founders of CASEL. And he did an assessment of ClassCraft that is really fantastic, digging in more point by point about the different pieces of how how Classcraft connects into CASEL and how effective it is. So we invite you to reach out to us if you want to know more, if you want to explore this for next year. We're always happy to have conversations and help you plan and get ready for, this very messy school year that's coming, and not ignore SEL. It's going to be very easy to ignore SEL and in the next school year just because of everything going on. And really, it's the worst possible time to be ignoring it. So this conversation needs to keep going, and whether it's with us or not, we really invite you to reflect about what virtual SEL learning means. So we have a few minutes. So if there's any questions, you can jump into the chat or into the Q&A. I want to thank you for your attention here and for engaging with us for the entirety of this session. So if you have any questions, please feel free.
While we're waiting for questions, I will remind people too that the good folks here at Classcraft will be in the hub for the conference, their virtual booth for the next couple hours. We still have more time to go for you people on the West Coast and all. Some of the East Coast people, I think, are kind of winding down their days, but we are, ongoing here. While we kind of go through, I'm just going to go through, I have just kind of closing notes that I have to just cover for a moment here. And then if there's any questions left, we can take those here, but let me just share my screen just to kind of wind down here. Again, thanking our sponsors and thanking Shawn and Classcraft today. Encourage you again to visit their booth. On behalf of everybody, we enjoyed having you all here today. I hope you've all gotten a lot out of this today. In addition to Classcraft, we want to thank CatchOn, FileWave Global, Teletherapy, GradeCam, Stanford Programs, and all other partners. I also want to tell you all that our conversation is ongoing. Matter of fact, next Wednesday is the return of our Lunch and Learn webinars at noon East time with Dr. Keisha Ray. This week will be about cybersecurity and remote learning, talking to a couple of districts about, keeping data private, cybersecurity concerns, and monitoring online activity of kids. You can go to the Tech Learning website, www.techlearning.com/events to register for that. That's all my housekeeping type items here I have to do. It looks like there may be one or two things in the chat. I'm going to stop my share here, and if there's anything left to do, feel free to pick it up there, Shawn, if you want to end it, and I'm all set on this end.
Sounds good. Thank you, Ray. So the chat is just thanks, and this is super interesting. So I'm glad you all found value here. I think that this is a really important time for education, where we have the opportunity here to rethink a lot of our practices, and it's a very stressful time as well. So take care of yourselves and take care of each other and your teams. And hopefully we can help you do that and do that with your kiddos in the upcoming years. But I think that I'm excited by just the wave of just really fantastic education professionals showing up and doing whatever they can to help the kids. And as a former teacher myself, that speaks a lot to me. So keep up the good work, everybody, and thank you so much for tuning in today.
Thank you.